Hello and welcome to our fifth lecture in the Intro to Newman series. This lecture is titled St. John Henry Newman's Legacy. You and I will never comprehend the full extent of Newman's legacy in our lifetime until we come to the beatific vision, God willing. But now that he is to be a doctor of the universal church, many more people around the world will be influenced by Newman. Now, it is humanly impossible to capture Newman's legacy in a 1-hour talk. If you've heard my previous 4 lectures on his life, sermons, writings, poetry, prayers, meditations, and devotions, certainly you can agree with this statement. That said, how can we adequately describe his legacy? What has he left to the church and the world that will endure? One way to answer that is to look at the principal ways in which Newman has already influenced the world, so that is what we will do in this lecture. With the recent declaration that Newman will be declared a doctor on November 1st this year, 2025, I think we can look at his legacy in terms of his doctorship, his doctorhood. Doctor comes from the Latin word docere, which means to teach. Looking at Newman as a teacher, I see him as a teacher of conscience, a teacher of truth, and a teacher of holiness. Newman as teacher of conscience. Newman calls conscience a voice, or the echo of a voice, imperative and constraining, like no other dictate in the whole of our experience. He wrote, "Conscience is nearer to me than any other means of knowledge. It provides for the mind a real image of God as a medium of worship." Newman calls conscience the voice of God, and the voice of God in the nature and heart of man as distinct from the voice of revelation. And he calls conscience the aboriginal vicar of Christ. Newman famously said, "Certainly if I am obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, which indeed does not seem quite the thing, I shall drink to the Pope if you please, still to conscience first and to the Pope afterwards." This single quote has probably been misused by more people who try to prioritize their own subjective beliefs or their own morality over that of the Church and her teaching. It certainly seems like Newman is placing individual people in a place above the Pope by toasting conscience first. However, he is not putting the papacy in opposition to the primacy of conscience. No, rather he is saying the papacy is based on conscience, and the papacy guarantees conscience. If one seriously thinks a papal order or law or command is wrong, then to obey it goes against one's conscience, and that is a sin, according to Newman. Conscience, however misguided, is supreme. However, the dictate of conscience, in order to prevail against the voice of the Pope, must follow upon serious thought, prayer, and all available means of arriving at a right judgment on the matter in question. Newman wrote that conscience is ever to be obeyed whether it tells it truly or erroneously. He also thought that the state should have a conscience. He saw conscience as having a triple office, that of priest, prophet, and king. He wrote, "Conscience is a prophet in its informations, a monarch in its peremptoriness, a priest in its blessings and anathemas." To paraphrase that, conscience is a prophet because it has knowledge for us beforehand. It's a priest because it blesses us when we do good and chastises us when we do wrong. And it's a king because it demands with authority our obedience. Having established Newman as a champion and teacher of conscience during his life, let us look at some examples of his legacy in this area. The White Rose movement in Germany during World War II is Newman's legacy regarding conscience put into practice. I'm going to read from the introduction to this book, Conscience Before Conformity, by Paul Shrimpton, published by Gracewing Press. Conscience Before Conformity, about the White Rose movement. Sophie Scholl may not be a household name in Britain or in the US or Canada, but she is something of a legend in Germany, with two films made about her life and nearly 200 schools named after her, as well as streets and squares. At the turn of the millennium, she was voted Woman of the 20th Century by readers of the German magazine Brigitte, and a popular television series called Greatest Germans dubbed her the greatest German woman of all time. Sophie was a 21-year-old student of biology and philosophy at the time of her execution in February 1943, when she was beheaded along with her brother Hans for urging fellow students at Munich University to oppose the Nazi regime. Brother and sister Scholl belonged to a group of students who spoke out against National Socialism and circulated thousands of leaflets telling other Germans that they had a moral duty to resist Hitler. Adopting the name the White Rose, these students also condemned the persecution of Jews in the year when Hitler began to implement the final solution. When the police caught Sophie and Hans distributing leaflets at the university, they were interrogated by the Gestapo over 4 days, tried in court, and then, on Hitler's orders, guillotined. We know from the transcripts of the trial that Sophie said she had been compelled by her Christian conscience to peacefully oppose the Nazi regime. The same was true for Hans, for he, like his sister, had found in prayer and reading the Christian resources and inspiration to make sense of the brutal and demonic world around him. So I read that they were influenced by reading the Christian resources, and specifically, we find that to be the writings of St. John Henry Newman. Through a philosopher and cultural historian, Theodor Hecker, Newman's teachings on conscience were brought to this small group of German students and academics in Munich who refused to submit to the Nazis. Newman's translators and commentators were influential in enabling them to make sense of National Socialism, and they in turn helped to sustain a student resistance group opposed to Nazism, which went under the name of the White Rose. One section of the book specifically talks about Sophie had now begun to read the sermons of John Henry Newman, having discovered his writings in October 1941 when she and Fritz, her boyfriend, visited a nonconformist bookshop in Aulendorf, recommended by someone else. Though Sophie does not mention her discovery of Newman in any of her letters, one of her own friends, Suzanne Hirzel, recalls how in 1941 she was introduced to Newman by Sophie, saying, Sophie read constantly and one day handed me a book by Cardinal Newman. What? You don't know him? There's a wonderful world awaiting you there. So this group published 7 pamphlets and distributed them at the university and elsewhere in Germany. And they called upon the German citizens to follow their conscience in accord with Newman's teachings on conscience. After Sophie and Hans's execution, Fritz, her boyfriend, his last letter to Sophie lamented the loss of the 2 volumes of Newman's sermons she had given to him and of Hecker's Creator and Creation book. Sophie was dead when he wrote this letter. When Fritz visited her parents, the present he gave them was the collection of Newman's sermons, translated by Hecker, called The Church and the World. Hecker also visited the Scholls, and he signed the visitor's book at their house with Newman's motto as a cardinal, Cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. Both Fritz and Hecker, it seems, considered Newman's words appropriate for the grief experienced by the Scholls. Newman's legacy in Germany continued and was found with Joseph Ratzinger, who later, as a cardinal, once said this in an opening address to a symposium on Newman in Rome. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger said, "For us at that time, Newman's teaching on conscience became an important foundation for theological personalism, which was drawing us all in its sway. Our image of the human being, as well as our image of the church, was permeated by this, Newman's point of departure. We had experienced the claim of a totalitarian party which understood itself as the fulfillment of history and which negated the conscience of the individual," Ratzinger says. One of its leaders, Hermann Göring, had said, "I have no conscience. My conscience is Adolf Hitler." The appalling devastation of humanity that followed was before our eyes. Ratzinger goes on to say, precisely because Newman interpreted the existence of the human being from conscience, that is, from the relationship between God and the soul, was it clear that this personalism is not individualism, and that being bound by conscience does not mean being free to make random choices. The exact opposite is the case. Freedom of conscience, Newman told us, is not identical with the right to dispense with conscience, to ignore a lawgiver and judge, to be independent of unseen obligations. Ratzinger clarified that this way of conscience is everything other than a way of self-sufficient subjectivity. It is the way of obedience to objective truth. It seemed to Ratzinger that the characteristic of the great doctor of the Church was that he, Newman, teaches not only through his thought and speech, but also by his life, because within him thought and life are interpenetrated and defined. On account of this, Newman belongs to the great teachers of the Church, because he both touches our hearts and enlightens our thinking. That was back many years ago. Ratzinger was already talking about Newman as a teacher and thus a doctor of the church. Prophetic indeed. A second example of Newman as teacher of conscience is to be found in the Second Vatican Council. Ian Carr, may he rest in peace, and others have referred to St. John Henry Newman as the father of the Second Vatican Council. Conscience featured 52 times in the documents of Vatican II. The Council taught that human dignity consists in being creatures who by nature have the godlike ability to reason and choose. Thus all people are bound to seek, embrace, and live the truth faithfully. Every human agent has the capacity for and fundamental principles of conscience. Conscience is experienced as an inner voice, sanctuary, or tribunal, yet one which mediates a universal moral law which is objectively given by nature, reason, God, rather than personally invented. Thus, conscience summons us to inscribe the divine law in every aspect of life by seeking good and avoiding evil, loving God and neighbor, keeping the commandments and universal norms of morality. To follow a well-formed conscience is not merely a right, but a duty. Persons are judged according to how they form and follow particular judgments of conscience. Whether because of their own fault or not, agents may err in matters of conscience. Catholics should therefore seek to form their consciences so that they are dutifully conformed to the divine law itself and submissive toward the Church's teaching office, which authentically interprets that law in the light of the gospel. Claims of personal freedom or of obedience to civil laws or superiors do not excuse a failure to abide by the universal principles of conscience. Freedom of thought, conscience, and religion should be respected by civil authorities, and people should not be coerced in matters of religion. Here's three further examples for you. First, the Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae recognizes that the search for truth is a social one, accomplished with teaching, communication, and dialogue. It is also a personal search, for it is by personal assent that men must adhere to the truth they have discovered. This language of personal assent is straight from Newman, from his great work, Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. Second, from Gaudium et Spes, quote, man's dignity therefore requires him to act out of conscience and free choice, as moved and drawn in a personal way from within, and not by blind impulses in himself or by mere external constraint. Let us focus on the middle phrase, as moved and drawn in a personal way from within. One can see how this might be the most concise summary of real assent ever written. Clearly, it is Newman inspired, as he wrote that real assent involves images in the imagination, is not necessarily practical but motivating, and is personal. Newman equated real assent with belief. Third example, the Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes speaks 39 times of conscience, and the language used is remarkably similar to that of Newman. For the Council Fathers, it was critical to focus on conscience as part of the created soul of man, in the image of God, as a part of an anthropology they wanted to promulgate to the modern world in a pastoral way. For Newman, conscience was evidence of God, his voice, his law, and a witness to each person of God's existence. For the Council Fathers, conscience was essential to the dignity of the human person. For Newman, it was the great dignity of conscience which demands our obedience. For both the Council Fathers and Newman, abandoning one's conscience leads to atheism. This is because an atheist does not believe in God, and if thus the voice of God is ignored in one's conscience, leading them to atheism. Likewise, in Gaudium et Spes and in Newman's works, we find that one must properly form one's conscience, a lifelong effort, but one with great reward. To summarize, we have barely scratched the surface of Newman as teacher of conscience. He insisted that conscience be respected and followed above all else, but it must be a properly formed conscience. Its authority lies in its pointing us to moral and religious truth, prompting us to follow God's will. Which is a good segue into the next point, Newman as doctor, teacher of truth. I'm going to pause right now for some questions. Oh. Newman as teacher of truth. First, development of doctrine. Newman's lifelong pursuit of truth was extraordinary and was the illuminating principle of his life. As he aged and grew, he realized that some truths of the Christian faith were not present or fully articulated in the early church. For example, this is just one example of many, the Eucharistic doctrine of transubstantiation. As an Anglican, he rejected transubstantiation, calling it shocking. From Tract 90, yes, that most famous of tracts, Newman rejected the notion that, quote, the material elements are changed into an earthly, fleshly, and organized body, extended in size, distinct in its parts. Rejecting also that it is a body or substance of a certain extension and bulk in space, and that a certain figure and due disposition of parts, whereas we hold that the only substance such is the bread which we see. End quote. To the rescue, so to speak, came Dr. Charles Russell, who taught at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. Russell began to correspond with Newman in 1843, and he noted that Newman's problems with the Church of Rome were not in the first place theological, but imaginative, a lack of imagination with regards to what transubstantiation might actually mean. Russell defended the common faith of Catholics by clarifying what the Church meant by transubstantiation, writing to Newman, I beg then with the most respectful earnestness to assure you that you have utterly misconceived our belief upon this point of transubstantiation, raising up to yourself in it horrors, which every member of our church discards as impious and revolting. Your whole exposition of the article, number 28 of the 39 articles, on transubstantiation, proceeds on the supposition that our Catholic conception of transubstantiation is of the most gross and repulsive nature, that we think of the adorable body of our Lord in the Eucharist as of an earthly and fleshly thing, of the eating and drinking as animal and corporeal actions, a carnal eating. End quote. By repudiating in strong language the notion that Catholics could believe such things about the Eucharist, Russell helped Newman understand better those aspects which Newman found the most difficult to accept. But to overcome the question of transubstantiation as not being taught by the primitive church, and to overcome other questions regarding doctrine, Newman began writing his famous essay on the development of Christian doctrine. As he proceeded writing this great work, Newman found that, quote, my view so clear that instead of speaking any more of the Roman Catholics, I boldly just called them Catholics. Before I got to the end, I resolved to be received. End quote. This realization that the language of the primitive church might not contain all the contemporary language of a given doctrine, but that nonetheless the doctrine is still truly and fully present in the church, was a breakthrough. The whole truth was present in the initial deposit of faith. It just took time for the language about it to develop. It was a breakthrough so much so that Newman wrote of Russell that he had, quote, perhaps more to do with my conversion than anyone else, end quote. So there's possibly a sixth great cause of Newman's conversion to add to the other five that I brought up in my first talk, the influence of this Charles Russell. The legacy then of Newman's lifelong pursuit of truth may be seen in his conversion and converting work, Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. This essay is a work in two parts. In the first part, Newman looks at developments of doctrine as viewed in themselves and relative to doctrinal corruptions. In the second part, he asserts that there are 7 notes of a genuine development. These notes are preservation of its type, continuity of its principles, its power of assimilation, its logical sequence, anticipation of its future, conservative action upon its past, and 7, its chronic vigor. Newman admits that these have varying applicability, but they all work together to aid one person, in discriminating between healthy developments and those of corruption and decay. Unfortunately, some progressive or liberal theologians use Newman's essay on development of doctrine to promote changing doctrine or, quote, developing it to suit modern societal or cultural norms. In other words, to change truth or to allow immoral practices. Newman wrote, there is no new beginning of truth, but the continuance of a real tradition. So we must always be careful to apply Newman's 7 notes of a genuine development to any proposed development, evolution, or progression. As Tracy Rowland wrote in her essay titled John Henry Newman on the Development of Doctrine, a via media between intellectualism and historicism, Newman provided the Church with an organic account of tradition and an explanation of the work of the sensus fidelium in both building up and defending the tradition. In doing so, he resolved one of the great theological crises of modern times with considerable pastoral consequences. Newman's seminal work amplifies the importance of the relationship between spirituality and dogmatic theology, and between holiness and conscience. In every generation, there needs to be people with extensive knowledge of the tradition, not just a knowledge of doctrinal propositions and dogmas, but an understanding of the whole structure of the Christian mysteries, so that pastoral problems that arise in relation to one particular area can be resolved without causing damage in ancillary areas. Newman was one of those exemplary members, Roland writes. Without such persons in the life of the church, there was always the risk of slipping over the edge of a dry and pastorally insensitive intellectualism on the one side, or a voluntarist historicism subservient to the zeitgeist on the other. End quote from Tracy Rowland. Let us now talk about the ordinariates, ecumenism, and conversion. In the Catholic Church resides the fullness of truth. That's why I became Catholic. Maybe that's why you are Catholic. Newman discovered this to be true, and that's why he became Catholic also. Thus, part of his legacy is as a seeker of truth, a finder of truth, and when he found it, he united himself to it and taught it. Newman deserves to be remembered as one of the great theologians of conversion, as a forerunner of ecumenism, and as one whose insights into Christian unity anticipated the Second Vatican Council. Newman came to realize that if the Catholic Church meant life, since it had been established by the author of life himself, separation from the Church meant death. He did not convert because of despair, but because of conscience. His was not an emotional conversion, but an intellectual one. Newman never undermined the Church of England publicly. Thus, in his Apologia, he reflects on his past religious home as a time-honored institution of noble historical memories, a monument of ancient wisdom, a momentous arm of political strength, a great national organ, a source of vast popular advantage, and to a certain point, a witness and teacher of religious truth. He adds very charitably that the Church of England has been the instrument of Providence in conferring great benefits on me, and as I have received so much good from the Anglican establishment itself, can I have the heart, or rather the want of charity, to wish to see it overthrown? Clearly, rather than burn bridges, Newman desired to maintain friendships through public charitable discourse. The most ecumenical imagery Newman used came in several statements he made, in which he described the Church of England as a breakwater against skepticism. His breakwater metaphor allowed him to be optimistic and to see the good, the value in the Church of England as a force against atheism, against Unitarianism, skepticism, and all the other isms that threatened the Christian faith. He did not want to do anything to weaken this breakwater, not only because he had friends in the Anglican Church, but because he saw it as a witness and teacher of religious truth. He saw himself as proof that God uses the Anglican Church to accomplish his will and to confer great benefits on people. Thus, it was a, quote, serviceable breakwater against doctrinal errors more fundamental than its own, end quote. Newman preferred the word breakwater to bulwark because a breakwater is not an integral part of what it defends, and it is useful if it detracts from the volume and force of error. If Christendom is the shoreline, and waves of error are crashing upon its beaches, eroding the faithful sands inch by inch, the breakwater of Anglicanism helps to prevent the powerful waves of atheism from doing their worst. Newman's most important ecumenical theory is that ecumenism must help people move up the ladder toward Catholicism, not down the ladder toward atheism or skepticism. Ecumenism must help others to deepen their faith, not renounce it. Ecumenism must bring others out of shadows and into the light of truth, not dilute it. Newman rejected any form of reductionism and called for sincere believers to explore the implications of what they believe and thus to progress toward the fullness of Catholic truth. The documents of the Second Vatican Council favor frank and open dialogue, unmarred by polemics on one hand or false Irenicism on the other. Dialogue that Newman exemplified in his hundreds of personal letters to potential converts and in his public writings and sermons. Remember that great influence Newman had on the fathers of the Vatican II, I just talked about earlier? Well, that council also paved the way for the Church's single greatest act of ecumenism with Anglicans, the ordinariates throughout the world, described by some as, quote, realized ecumenism as distinct from the ecumenism of interminable, often futile dialogue having only vaguely eschatological horizons, end quote. I quoted Dr. Clint Brand, a friend of mine and a parishioner at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Walsingham in Houston, Texas, and professor of English at St. Thomas University, Houston. Pope Benedict XVI's 2009 Apostolic Constitution Anglicanorum Cetibus that created the ordinariates quotes Lumen Gentium, saying, "Many elements of sanctification and of truth are found outside the Catholic Church's visible confines. Since these are gifts properly belonging to the Church of Christ, they are forces impelling towards Catholic unity." End quote. So truth impels toward unity. Newman saw that too, and he taught it. Many see Newman as a forerunner, one who stood on the threshold of a new ecumenical age. In him, the convert spoke louder than the ecumenist, Avery Cardinal Dulles said. He did succeed in combining a loyal adherence to the Catholic Church with a deep concern for Christian unity and a measure of appreciation for the workings of grace in other Christian communions. End quote by Dulles. That accurate assessment shows Newman's moderation and his care for his beloved Anglican Church, but also his understanding of the importance of lifelong conversion of heart and search for truth that made him a saint and now a doctor of the Church. St. John Henry Newman was more of a convert than an ecumenist. His lifelong desire for the fullness of truth led him into the one true fold. He sought for his heart to speak to God's heart, cor ad cor loquitur. Today he is a saint, so his journey to truth and intimate union with God is perfected. However, his role continues as an ecumenical beacon for those not yet in full communion with the Catholic Church. I have personally heard of many people who read Newman, and he helped them leave Protestantism and become Catholic. One of Newman's famous quotes is, "To be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant." I would also add, "And to know Newman is to cease to be Protestant." Newman as teacher of holiness. Last session, we looked at Newman's prayers, meditations, and devotions. We began to see his piety and sanctity lived out daily in his prayer life. As a teacher of holiness, Newman was a father of souls, visiting all parishioners, as a tutor at Oriel, as prior of the oratory in Birmingham, and as a spiritual director. He led others to holiness during his lifetime through his ministry as both an Anglican and Catholic priest. As a brand new Anglican priest, Father Newman made it his personal goal to visit all the families in his parish in Oxford at St. Clement's. Once he procured an up-to-date list of all his parishioners, he walked around, going house to house, visiting them, introducing himself, and getting to know them. He wrote of this endeavor, saying, "The readiest way of finding access to a man's heart is to go into his house." He even remarked to his own mother, saying, "I shall know my parishioners and be known by them," echoing the words of our Lord Jesus, "I am the good shepherd, I know my own and am known by them." Newman visited all the houses in his parish within 2 months, being received with civility, cheerfulness, and in some cases, surprise. Next, as a tutor at Oriel College, Newman broke new ground in terms of a tutor's approach to his pupils. He saw the role of tutor as not merely an intellectual one, but also a pastoral one. He considered a college tutor to have the care of souls. Newman sought to influence the undergraduates by being their friend and trying to approach them in terms of almost equality. Someone wrote of Newman as a tutor saying, "He was never condescending with us, never authoritative, but what he said carried conviction along with it." This approach to being a tutor was not without its critics, but many saw it as a positive return to the tutor's original pastoral role that had fallen into disuse over the centuries. One fellow Oxford professor noted Newman's influence, quote, "was unlike anything else in our time, and that there was a mysterious veneration of Newman, as if Ambrose or Augustine of elder ages had reappeared." End quote. Ironically and providentially, Newman now joins these two saints, Ambrose and Augustine, in the company of doctors of the Church. As a teacher of holiness, this same care for souls embraced by Newman would stay with him his whole life. As the pastor for the village of Littlemore, as the prior of the Birmingham Oratory he founded, and as spiritual director for countless people. He was very concerned for the education of the laity. Both as an Anglican and a Catholic, Newman demonstrated the truth of his remark that, quote, "from first to last, education in this large sense of the word has been my line." In 1851 he lectured, saying, "I want an intelligent, well-instructed laity. I wish you to enlarge your knowledge, to cultivate your reason, to get an insight into the relation of truth to truth, to learn to view things as they are, to understand how faith and reason stand to each other, what are the bases and principles of Catholicism, and where lie the main inconsistencies and absurdities of the Protestant theory." End quote. Newman led a hidden life of charity and almsgiving that only became publicly known after his death. Today, the Birmingham Oratorians tell of the Cardinal, quote, "taking great pains, when he was a Catholic priest in Birmingham, to assist the unemployed to find work, and also he was very generous in almsgiving." On occasion, Newman would give a small box to a deserving person that contained a £5 note, which was a significant sum in those days. Quote, "One of his purposes was not just to relieve the distress of the moment, but to help the person pay off their debts and get their business back on track," said Father Harrison of the Oratory to King Charles III on his September 3rd, 2025 visit to the Birmingham Oratory. In my third lecture in this series, I mentioned Newman's 31 volumes of letters. Although Newman made it clear that he was not assuming the role of a spiritual director, many of his letters contained informal spiritual direction, in other words, a teacher of holiness. To one lady who was unsure about which religious order she should join, Newman wrote, "We cannot have everything in this world, but we can have the greatest of all, God's presence, God's guidance. May you have it abundantly wherever you are, and you will, but you must leave yourself in His hands, who loves you." In an 1850 imaginary letter to an Anglo-Catholic, Newman wrote, "Bear with me while I give you one piece of advice. It is this: while you are looking about for a new communion, have nothing to do with a branch church. You have had enough experience of branch churches already, and you know very well what they are. Depend on depend upon it, such is as one, such is another. They may differ in accidents, certainly, but after all, a branch is a branch, and no branch is a tree. Depend on it, my brethren, it is not worth while leaving one branch for another." End quote. This happens to be advice I myself considered when I was an Anglo-Catholic trying to decide where to go when I left the Episcopal Church. Don't jump to another branch, but rather go to the tree, the Catholic Church. Newman's legacy as a teacher of holiness extends to us today and in the future. through his life, his works, and his being a good priest throughout his whole life. Let us now look at Newman as teacher of holiness in the beauty of the liturgy, especially of the Mass. At the heart of Newman's understanding of his priestly role as a Catholic was that the liturgy is a means of grace and the preparation for eternal life, all of which was centered upon the action of the altar. His priesthood, therefore, was as much sacramental and devotional as it was educational or didactic. He took great care and trouble to ensure that Mass was celebrated with due decorum and worthy music. When he had occasion to celebrate Mass privately, he was caught up in awe at the mystery to which he was a close witness at the altar, wrapped in wonder at the mystery of the reality hidden beneath the surface of what he was doing. Newman's own thoughts about the awesomeness of the liturgy may be found in that short novel, Loss and Gain. In this quote I'm about to read, Newman uses the word awful, not in a negative sense, but to mean full of awe or awe-inspiring. Let us take these words as Newman's own. Quote from Loss and Gain. To me, nothing is so consoling, so piercing, so thrilling, so overcoming as the Mass, said as it is among us. I could attend Masses forever and not be tired. It is not a mere form of words, it is a great action, the greatest action that can be on earth. It is not the invocation or request merely, but if I dare use the word, the evocation or elicitation of the eternal. He becomes present on the altar in flesh and blood, before whom angels bow and devils tremble. That is the awful event which is the scope and is the interpretation of every part of the solemnity. Words are necessary, but as means, not as ends. They are not mere addresses to the throne of grace. They are instruments of what is far higher, of consecration, of sacrifice. End quote. In one of his meditations, Newman wrote the following: O most sacred, most loving heart of Jesus, thou art concealed in the Holy Eucharist, and thou beatest for us still. Now, as then, thou sayest, Desiderio desideravi, with desire have I desired. I worship thee then with all my best love and awe, with my fervent affection, with my most subdued, most resolved will. O my God, when thou dost condescend to suffer me to receive thee, to eat and drink thee, and thou for a while takest up thy abode within me, O make my heart beat with thy heart. As a teacher of holiness, we see how Newman expressed his love for God in prayer and how he desired cor ad cor loquitur. He longed for heart to speak with heart. Or in the prayer I just read, he longed for heart to beat with heart. What I hope you take from this whole Intro to Newman series is that John Henry Newman was a real person, a sinner like you and me, but someone whose life is an open book for us to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest, so that we too might be holy like him, that our hearts may speak to God's heart, and that we too might become saints like John Henry. May many more souls be saved because of his holy life. I would now like to share with you about 5 minutes of comments from Bishop Stephen Lopes, our Bishop of the Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, in a podcast from Ignatius Press recorded on September 8th, 2025. Just two snippets of Bishop Lopes on this Ignatius Press podcast. It's audio only, so I will share sound as I share this screen and sound with you. So the first voice you'll hear is the interviewer. I forget his name. Sorry. And then he'll ask Bishop Lopes a question. This is about, the podcast about Newman being declared a doctor of the church and what that means in general.
Doctor of the Church really gives us an opportunity to discuss. So why don't we jump right in? And Bishop Lopes, I'll begin with you and just kind of ask you, both as a theological man and as a working bishop, what is the significance of this figure, Newman, not only being canonized as a saint, but now being set apart in this very rarefied air as a doctor of the Church?
I was struck by the way that you introduced the topic, because you used the formal title twice, Doctor of the Universal Church. Because I think more than other titles that we can give to saints, the doctor title is characterized by its universality, because it's a declaration by the Church that this saint's theology, that this saint's reflection on the mystery of God is universally valid and universally appealing. It's not a particular culture, a particular language, or a particular time and place in the Church, but that there's a perennial nature to the contribution that this saint brings forward. I remember more years ago than I care now to think about, being in St. Peter's Square when St. Therese of Lisieux was declared a doctor of the Church. Her theological writings, shall we say, are not voluminous. But, then Pope St. John Paul II making that declaration. But nevertheless, her meditation on the little way, her intimacy with Christ in that way, is something that transcends time, space, culture, and has a relevance for people of every age. That's the nature of the declaration. So while certainly in the ordinariate we're very happy with Newman receiving this particular recognition by the Church, because you will hear it said so many times in my diocese, Newman is one of us. Nevertheless, the declaration is that he's more than one of us. He's one of all of us. And so I think that universal character of this thing is really very important.
There you have Bishop Lopes on the universal character of Newman being doctor of the Church. And then I have another little quote from his a little bit later. Here we go.
His importance as a figure in the Church and society now.
I wonder if I might reframe it just a bit. Rather than talking about a Newman moment, and I agree with you, that's not to disagree, but to say, we're almost in a new Oxford movement moment. When you think about, Newman comes onto the scene and such an integral part of what became the Oxford movement. Why? Because the ravages of the Industrial Revolution and it kind of tearing at the very fabric of society, and the upswing of just kind of this rampant secularism, dehumanization. This is Dickinson's time, and the things of faith and piety and devotion and your life with God and your friendship with God, all of a sudden seems so irrelevant with the marvel of what industry and progress can produce in God's place. And so Newman really kind of comes into that, breathing a fresh air theologically, but also in terms of piety, devotion. And then, one of the hallmarks of that Oxford movement was that this was not just a thing of the classroom or the pulpit even, but then going out into the very poorest neighborhoods in London, Birmingham, and preaching the gospel there. Even as a cardinal, Newman insisting to be, part of that fabric of inner city Birmingham and bringing the fruits of his theological reflection to the poor. Well, doesn't this time we're living in now, this moment, reflect in so many ways that very same kind of experience, except now it's not, we're not all enamored with factories and what they can produce, but it's the technological moment. I think this is one of the reasons why Pope Leo, has spent a lot of time, already talking about AI and what that means in terms of our relationship with God, in terms of our conceptions of the human person and human dignity. The technological revolution where babies grow up with an iPhone, and just how that completely changes their conception of the world, creates a new secularism, that arises now. And so, we're in a cultural landscape, I think, that is very similar to the cultural landscape that Newman and his friends were kind of experiencing. And so that recapturing the imagination theologically and in terms of faith and humanity, what it means to be a human being, that's where we are. And so the evangelization that's needed now, particularly, is, I think, very, very similar to the evangelization needed then. So this idea of a new Oxford movement, I think, it captures the moment.
Two quotes of Bishop Lopes on that podcast, and I'll share that link with you. Just give me a moment. The link to the podcast on the Ignatius Press website. I had it in my Thursday talk. Oh. Interesting. Don't see it. Just give me a moment here for just a second. There, I put it in the chat. The Ignatius Press podcast on Newman as Doctor of the Church. Feel free to listen to the whole thing. It's a very interesting podcast with Dr. Jennifer Martin and Bishop Lopes. With that, I will conclude my lecture on Newman's legacy, and that concludes my 5-part series, Introduction to St. John Henry Newman, Priest and Doctor of the Universal Church. Farewell.